There are lives that are defined by what they achieve, and then there are lives that are defined by what they lose. We are drawn to stories of triumph, of men and women who bend the world to their will. But there is a different kind of story, a quieter and perhaps more profound one, to be found in the lives of those who stand at the turning of the tide, who witness the magnificent world of their birth crumble into dust and memory. These are the people who must learn to navigate the ruins, to find meaning not in power or prestige, but in the simple, heartbreaking art of endurance. This is the story of one such man, Archduke Maximilian Eugen of Austria, the last prince of a ghost empire. To understand his life is to first understand the world that birthed him, a world that now feels as distant and fantastical as a fairy tale. Imagine the Austro Hungarian Empire in 1895, the year of his birth. It was not merely a country but a civilization, a sprawling, bewildering, and impossibly elegant tapestry woven from a dozen major nationalities: Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Croats, Serbs, Slovaks, Ukrainians, Romanians, and more, each with their own languages, cultures, and religions. All of these disparate threads were held together by the near mythical figure of their emperor. At its heart was Vienna, a city that had perfected the art of living during its luminous fin de siècle. It was a world of gilded opera houses where the revolutionary symphonies of Gustav Mahler soared, of smoky, hallowed coffee houses like the Café Central, where Sigmund Freud was mapping the uncharted territories of the human mind, and intellectuals debated the very future of modernity, and of opulent ballrooms where thousands of couples spun in waltz time under the light of crystal chandeliers. This was a society obsessed with titles, with tradition, with the precise placement of a bow or the correct form of a dress. Yet beneath this rigid surface, it was a crucible of creativity, giving birth to the shimmering erotic art of Gustav Klimt and the rebellious Vienna secession movement. And at the absolute pinnacle of this impossibly intricate pyramid stood the House of Habsburg, a dynasty so ancient and powerful it was considered not just royal, but semi-divine. Presiding over this magnificent, decaying edifice was Emperor Franz Joseph I. By 1895, he was already an old man, a living monument to a bygone age. Having ascended the throne in the revolutionary year of 1848, he had ruled for nearly half a century. He was the clamor, the buckle or clamp that personally held his fracturing empire together. He was also a profoundly tragic figure, a man defined by solemn duty and immense personal sorrow. His brother Maximilian had been executed by a firing squad in Mexico. His only son and heir, the brilliant but unstable Crown Prince Rudolph, had committed suicide with his young lover at the Mayerling hunting lodge in a scandal that was a national trauma, horrifying Europe and shattering the illusion of imperial stability. His beautiful and restless wife, the Empress Elizabeth, would soon be assassinated by an anarchist. Franz Joseph bore these unending tragedies with a stoic, almost inhuman reserve. He was the ultimate symbol of his empire, majestic, venerable, steeped in tradition, and profoundly, deeply sad. He was a bureaucrat-in-chief working tirelessly, rising before dawn each day to sit at his simple desk, a remote and lonely sovereign meticulously signing documents and managing the slow, graceful decline of his inheritance. Into this world of immense privilege and looming tragedy, Maximilian Eugen was born. He was not, however, born close to the throne. The tragedy at Mayerling had thrown the line of succession into chaos. With the crown prince dead, the heir was now the emperor's nephew, the brooding and hot-tempered Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and just behind him stood his younger brother, Archduke Otto Franz Joseph. Otto was everything the old emperor was not. While Franz Joseph was the embodiment of solemn duty, Otto was a figure of breathtaking scandal and reckless charm. Nicknamed Otto der Schöne, Otto the Handsome, he was dashing, witty, and pathologically unfaithful to his wife. His exploits were the talk of Vienna. He was once spotted in the hallway of the Sacher Hotel, about to be caught in a tryst, leaping into the corridor wearing nothing but his military sword. Another time, he attended a private dinner party and, in a drunken revelry, jumped onto the table and danced completely naked save for the order of the golden fleece around his neck. He was the dynasty's charismatic black sheep, a man whose charm was matched only by his irresponsibility. Maximilian's mother was the woman tasked with enduring this behavior, Princess Maria Josepha of Saxony. She was Otto's polar opposite. Pious, reserved, and possessed of an iron-willed sense of propriety, she was the anchor in their family's storm. She created a stable and deeply religious home for her two sons, a sanctuary of order she actively defended from the chaos of her husband's life. It was in this strange, fractured household, this crucible of dysfunction and devotion, that Maximilian and his older brother Karl were raised. They lived in the shadow of their father's reputation, a fact that almost certainly pushed them toward lives of intense discipline and duty as a direct reaction to his failings. Under the powerful, protective wing of their mother, the boys forged an unbreakable bond. Karl, 8 years older, was serious, gentle, and introspective, much like his mother. From an early age, he seemed to feel the weight of his potential destiny. He was not a brilliant intellectual or a charismatic leader, but he possessed a deep kindness and a powerful Catholic faith that guided his every action. Maximilian, as the second son, was granted a slightly different path. He was the spare, a role that came with both less pressure and a less certain purpose. He adored his older brother and looked up to him as a role model, but he developed his own quiet, thoughtful personality. He was a bright and diligent student, and in a move that was somewhat unusual for an archduke destined for a military career, he chose to pursue a formal degree in law. This decision speaks volumes about his character. It suggests a methodical and analytical mind, a desire to understand the intricate rules and structures that governed his world, not just to exist within them. It was a step towards the world of the Bürgertum, the professional class, signifying a modern, pragmatic mindset. Perhaps he envisioned a life not on the battlefield or at court, but in administration, in diplomacy, or simply as a well-educated gentleman managing his estates. He was a young man preparing for a life of predictable, comfortable, and aristocratic duty within a system he believed to be eternal. The two brothers were a study in contrast to their infamous father. While Otto burned brightly and self-destructively, his sons were models of decorum and duty. They were the hope of the dynasty's more conservative faction, proof that the Habsburg line could still produce sober and responsible men. They spent their youth moving between the family's Viennese palaces and their country estates, their lives dictated by the rigid rhythms of the imperial court. But outside the palace walls, the foundations of their world were cracking. The 19th century ideal of the nation-state was poison to a multinational empire. In the Balkans, Serbian nationalism, dreaming of a greater Serbia, was on the rise, directly challenging the empire's authority. In Prague and Budapest, calls for independence grew louder, and in the capitals of Europe, the great powers were engaging in a complex dance of alliances and an escalating arms race. The air was thick with the scent of coming conflict. The spark came on a hot summer's day, June 28, 1914, in the provincial city of Sarajevo. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the throne, and his wife Sophie were gunned down by a young Serbian nationalist. The assassination was a profound shock, a brutal act of violence that ripped through the fabric of the old order. For the imperial family, it was yet another personal tragedy in a long line of them. But for Maximilian, it had an immediate and life-altering consequence. With Franz Ferdinand dead, his beloved brother Karl was now the heir to the throne of the entire Austro Hungarian Empire, and he, Maximilian Eugen, the quiet law student, was suddenly second in line. The political fallout was swift and catastrophic. The assassination triggered the July crisis, a month of frantic ultimatums and diplomatic maneuverings that spiraled out of control. The old emperor, pushed by his generals, issued a harsh ultimatum to Serbia. Alliances clicked into place, armies mobilized, and within weeks the continent was engulfed in the flames of the First World War. It was supposed to be a short, punitive expedition, over by Christmas. In Vienna, crowds cheered and sang patriotic songs, caught up in a wave of jingoistic fervor. For the 19-year-old Maximilian, the future he had been planning for himself, a life of study, family, and gentlemanly duty, evaporated in the cannon smoke. His law books were put aside. Like every other young man of his generation born into the Belle Epoque, he was to put on a uniform and march off to fight for his emperor, his country, and his family. He was about to step out of the gilded, predictable world of the 19th century and into the brutal mechanized slaughter of the 20th. The war would not only test his courage, it would annihilate the very civilization he was fighting to defend, leaving him a prince with no throne, a soldier with no empire, and a man with no country. His long, quiet journey into the shadows was about to begin. The patriotic fervor that swept Vienna was built on a collective delusion of a swift and glorious war, but the reality Maximilian faced at the front was a baptism by fire. The ordered world of parades and protocols vanished, replaced by the chaos and industrial-scale horror of modern warfare. It was in these trenches, amidst the roar of artillery and the suffering of the common soldiers he commanded, that the young Archduke would be forged into a man, even as his brother ascended to the throne, inheriting a crown that grew heavier with each passing day of the conflict. The Vienna that Archduke Maximilian Eugen left behind in the sun-drenched, feverish summer of 1914 was a city intoxicated by the promise of a swift and glorious war. It was a metropolis of soaring patriotic songs echoing from its famous coffee houses, of handsome young officers in crisp, new uniforms being showered with flowers as they paraded down the Ringstrasse, and of a collective, almost blissful belief that the ancient might and tradition of the Austro Hungarian Empire would sweep aside the upstart Serbians and their Russian backers in a matter of weeks. For a 19-year-old archduke, steeped in the lore of his ancestors' military glory and the rigid code of aristocratic honor, this call to arms was not a tragedy, but the ultimate test of his breeding and his purpose. His legal studies at the university were unceremoniously abandoned, his quiet, scholarly pursuits forgotten. He exchanged the academic's robe for the lieutenant's tunic, his future no longer a matter of intellectual choice, but of military command. He was assigned to the imperial and royal army, and after his officer's training, he would be sent to face the maelstrom that was already beginning to tear his world apart. Whatever romantic, chivalrous notions Maximilian may have held about combat were quickly and brutally extinguished by the grinding, mechanized reality of 20th century warfare. This conflict was not a gallant cavalry charge across an open field, but a nightmarish industrial-scale slaughter conducted with machine guns, heavy artillery, and poison gas. He served as a major on multiple fronts, including the brutal Italian front, where armies fought in a surreal conflict that became known as the White War. Here, former allies now faced each other across treacherous, snow-covered mountain passes in the dizzying altitudes of the Alps. This was warfare at its most grueling and elemental. Soldiers battled not only a determined enemy but also frostbite that turned limbs black, sudden avalanches that could entomb entire platoons in seconds, and a gnawing starvation that was a constant companion. Here, the fundamental, perhaps fatal weakness of his multi-ethnic empire was laid bare. As an officer, Maximilian was directly responsible for the lives of men who spoke a dozen different languages: Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Croats, Ukrainians, and more, all fighting under the double-headed eagle of the Habsburgs. He had to inspire loyalty and courage in men who were often homesick peasants, conscripted from tiny, isolated villages hundreds of miles apart, united only by their shared uniform and their common, pervasive misery. He learned the harsh calculus of command, seeing both astonishing courage and abject terror. He saw the way high explosives could vaporize a man, leaving nothing behind, and the slow, agonizing death that came from infection festering in a muddy, waterlogged trench. This experience forged him. The thoughtful, somewhat sheltered young student was hardened into a pragmatic and respected military commander. He proved to be a capable and brave officer, earning decorations for his service, but the experience also instilled in him a profound and bone-deep weariness of war, a first-hand understanding of its obscene human cost that would shape his worldview for the rest of his life. In the midst of this continental carnage in the cold November of 1916, the single constant of his entire world disappeared. The old emperor, Franz Joseph, died at the age of 86 after a reign of 68 years. He was more than a man. He was an institution, the living symbol of the empire itself, the final great figure of the 19th century. With his death, the full, terrifying weight of the crumbling empire fell upon the shoulders of Maximilian's beloved older brother, who now became his imperial and royal apostolic majesty, Emperor Karl I of Austria and King of Hungary. Overnight, Maximilian's status changed dramatically. He was no longer just another archduke fighting in the vast imperial army. He was now the Kaisersbruder, the brother of the emperor. This new title brought him closer to the nerve center of power and strategy, but it also placed him in an agonizing position. He was now a direct witness to his brother's desperate, compassionate, and ultimately doomed struggle to save their inheritance from complete self-destruction. Karl was a fundamentally different man from his stern, stoic great-uncle. He was young, deeply compassionate, and devoutly religious. Unlike the old guard in the halls of power in Vienna and Berlin, he was genuinely horrified by the endless bloodshed. He had seen the suffering in the military hospitals with his own eyes and had spoken to the widows and orphans left behind. From the moment he took the throne, his reign became a singular, frantic quest for peace. He immediately curtailed the army's almost dictatorial power over the state, banned the brutal practice of flogging soldiers, and established a ministry for social welfare to combat the horrific poverty and starvation on the home front. These were the actions of a deeply moral man, trapped in a profoundly immoral situation. While Maximilian continued his duties at the front, he would have been keenly and anxiously aware of his brother's efforts. Watching from a distance as Karl tried to untangle the Gordian knot of alliances and political interests that kept the war machine grinding relentlessly on. Even in these darkest of times, life and love found a way to persist. In 1917, Maximilian took a brief leave from his military duties for the most important event of his personal life. At a palace in Luxembourg, a historic imperial retreat near Vienna, he married Princess Franziska zu Hohenlohe-Waldenburg-Schillingsfürst. She was a woman of impeccable aristocratic lineage, known for her sharp intelligence and quiet grace. Their wedding was a statement of profound hope, a defiant act of faith in the future, at a moment when the very concept of a future seemed uncertain. Surrounded by their families, in the heart of a starving and war-torn nation, they pledged their lives to one another. This union was no mere dynastic arrangement. It was a deep and genuine love match that would become the central pillar of Maximilian's existence. Franziska would be his partner, his confidant, and his anchor through the unimaginable storms that were about to break over their heads. For a brief, precious moment, the grim reality of the war receded, replaced by personal joy. But the respite was tragically short-lived. Back in the halls of power, Emperor Karl's desperate quest for peace was leading him toward disaster. Convinced that his German allies were unrealistic and expansionist in their war aims, he decided to take a desperate gamble. Using his brother-in-law, Prince Sixtus of Bourbon-Parma, an officer in the Belgian army, and thus on the opposing side, as a secret intermediary, he opened a back channel to the French government. In clandestine letters, he offered to support the restoration of Alsace-Lorraine to France and to champion the sovereignty of Belgium and Serbia in exchange for a general peace. It was a brave, if naive, attempt to break the diplomatic stalemate. For a time, it seemed like it might work. But in the spring of 1918, the new radical Prime Minister of France, Georges Clemenceau, infuriated by a deceptively arrogant statement from the Austro Hungarian foreign minister, publicly and cruelly revealed the secret negotiations. The scandal, which became known as the Sixtus Affair, was catastrophic. Karl was exposed as having gone behind the back of his most powerful ally, Germany. He was publicly branded a traitor by German hardliners, and his own government forced him into a position of humiliating subservience to the German high command, making him little more than a puppet. The peace emperor was now a virtual prisoner of the war he had tried so desperately to end. The failure of the Sixtus Affair was the beginning of the end. The final year of the war saw the complete and rapid disintegration of the Austro Hungarian Empire. On the front lines, the armies were exhausted, mutinous, and starving. At home, the civilians were no better off. The Allied blockade had brought the economy to a standstill, and severe food shortages led to riots in the streets of Vienna, Prague, and Budapest. The great multi-ethnic empire was tearing itself apart from within. One by one, the nationalities declared their independence. The Poles, the Czechs, the Slovaks, and the Southern Slavs all broke away, forming their own nations from the corpse of the old empire. By late October 1918, the military fronts had completely collapsed. Soldiers were abandoning their posts, throwing down their weapons, and simply walking home. The war was over, and they had lost everything. For Maximilian, returning to Vienna in those final chaotic days must have been a surreal nightmare. The city he came back to was not the joyous patriotic capital he had left 4 years earlier. It was a place of hunger, defeat, bitterness, and revolution. The imperial authority had evaporated into thin air. On November 11th, 1918, the very same day the armistice was signed on the Western Front, the last act of the 600-year Habsburg drama played out at Schönbrunn Palace. Emperor Karl, surrounded by his loyal family, including Maximilian, was pressured by the ministers of the new Republican government to formally abdicate. A man of deep faith, Karl refused. He believed his crown was a divine trust from God that no man could force him to surrender. Instead, after hours of agonizing deliberation, he signed a proclamation in which he renounced every participation in the administration of the state. It was a carefully worded abdication in all but name. The next day, the Republic of German Austria was declared. The Habsburg rule was over. The family were now prisoners in their own home, their palaces surrounded by hostile Republican guards. Their fate was terrifyingly uncertain. Were they to be arrested, put on trial, executed, as their Romanov cousins had been in a cellar in Russia just a few months earlier? The new government wanted them gone. After months of tense negotiation, it was arranged for them to leave the country. On the cold, damp evening of March 23, 1919, the imperial family boarded a train at a small local station to avoid crowds. Maximilian, his pregnant wife Franziska, his brother Karl, the Empress Zita, and their children traveled in secrecy, like fugitives in their own land. As the train reached the Swiss border, it stopped. An officer of the new republic entered their carriage to formally escort them from their homeland. According to witnesses, Karl looked out the window at the receding mountains of his beloved Austria one last time. He had left as a boy of 4 for his first trip abroad and returned as a man of 31, a deposed emperor with no home, no fortune, and no future. Maximilian stood by his brother's side, a silent witness to the final collapse, his own life irrevocably broken. Everything he had been born to be, everything he had fought for, was gone. As the train steamed across the border into Switzerland, he crossed a line not just between two countries, but between two worlds. The life of Archduke Maximilian Eugen of Austria was over. The life of a penniless exile was about to begin. Their arrival in Switzerland marked not the end of their ordeal, but the beginning of a new, quieter struggle. Stripped of their titles, their homeland, and their immense fortune by the stroke of a pen, the family faced the harsh realities of a stateless existence. While Maximilian grappled with the practicalities of survival, his brother Karl remained consumed by the dream of restoration, a dream that would lead him to 2 desperate gambles for the Hungarian throne, forcing Maximilian to watch from afar as his brother's tragic destiny played out to its heartbreaking conclusion. The crossing of the border into Switzerland in the spring of 1919 was not an escape to freedom, but a somber passage into a gilded cage. For Archduke Maximilian, his brother Emperor Karl, and the remnants of the imperial family, the initial fleeting relief of leaving a hostile and revolutionary Vienna was swiftly replaced by the cold, disorienting, and deeply humiliating reality of exile. They were no longer the rulers of a vast, multi-ethnic empire. They were, in the starkest terms, stateless refugees. As guests of the Swiss government, they lived under a strict and watchful eye, their movements monitored, their mail read, and their political activities expressly forbidden. The magnificent, predictable life of palaces, ancient protocols, and boundless wealth had vanished overnight, replaced by a precarious existence in rented villas. Their survival now depended on the strained charity of European relatives and the dwindling value of the personal jewels Empress Zita had, with remarkable foresight, managed to sew into the linings of her children's clothes. This sudden, violent plunge from the absolute pinnacle of society to the uncertain life of an émigré was a profound and shattering psychological shock. What made their situation truly desperate, however, was a piece of legislation passed by the new Austrian Republic, the Habsburg Law of 1919. This was not merely a political document. It was a calculated act of legal and financial annihilation designed to permanently erase the dynasty from the nation's future. It formally and forever dethroned the House of Habsburg Lorraine, stripping them of their sovereign rights. It then banished every member of the family from Austrian soil, the homeland they had ruled for over 600 years, unless they formally renounced all their titles, surrendered all claims to the throne, and declared themselves loyal, ordinary citizens of the Republic. For Karl, an emperor anointed by God in a sacred coronation, this was a moral and spiritual impossibility, an act of apostasy against his own destiny. For Maximilian, whose entire identity had been forged in the crucible of loyalty to his brother and their sacred heritage, it was equally unthinkable. The law's final, devastating blow was the wholesale confiscation of all dynastic properties. The palaces, the hunting lodges, the vast estates, the priceless art collections accumulated over centuries, and a significant portion of the family's personal wealth. In a single ruthless stroke of a pen, they were made not only homeless and stateless, but destitute. They were living ghosts, stripped of their past and with no clear vision of a future. In this suffocating state of limbo, Karl's imperial spirit remained defiantly unbroken, while Maximilian, ever the pragmatist, was forced to grapple with the mundane, agonizing realities of their new life, meticulously managing their meager funds, caring for his pregnant wife Franziska, and shielding her from the worst of the stress. His brother was consumed by a single, burning, all-encompassing ambition: restoration. He had never abdicated the throne of Hungary, a kingdom that, unlike Austria, had not declared itself a republic. Hungary was in chaos, having just endured a short-lived and brutal communist revolution under Bela Kun, and was now governed by a conservative regent, Admiral Miklos Horthy, a man who had once sworn a solemn oath of personal loyalty to Karl as his king. In the person of Horthy, Karl saw his best and perhaps only hope for a return to power and a restoration of legitimate order. In the spring of 1921, Karl made his first move. In a daring and secretive journey that could have been torn from the pages of a novel, he traveled across Europe in disguise and appeared unannounced in Budapest at the royal palace on Easter Sunday. He confronted Horthy directly, reminding him of his sacred oath and demanding he hand over power so the rightful king could reclaim his throne. The admiral, caught between his old loyalty and his new comfortable political reality, was stunned. He prevaricated, offering a stream of excuses. The time was not right. The neighboring countries of the Little Entente would invade. The Allies would never permit a Habsburg restoration. Karl, a man of profound honor who naively expected others to be the same, could not force the issue without plunging the nation he loved into civil war. Defeated and utterly heartbroken by what he saw as a deep personal betrayal, he was quietly escorted back to the border. For Maximilian, waiting anxiously in Switzerland for news, the failure was a bitter blow, a terrifying sign that the world's doors were closing on them for good. But Karl refused to give up. His sense of duty would not allow it. 6 months later, in October 1921, he launched a second, far more dramatic and ultimately tragic attempt. This time, he and the equally courageous Empress Zita flew into Hungary on a rickety airplane, landing precariously in a field where loyalist troops were waiting. A small, devoted army quickly formed around them, and they began a tragic, ill-fated march on Budapest. For a few heady, hopeful days, it seemed as if history itself might be reversed. Royalist sentiment was strong in the countryside, and their columns swelled as it advanced on the capital. From Switzerland, Maximilian would have followed the fragmented news reports with a heart torn between desperate hope and paralyzing terror. This was his brother's final gamble, a desperate throw of the dice for everything they had lost. The dream ended in bloodshed and cannon smoke just outside Budapest. Horthy, now cornered and declaring Karl's attempt an act of high treason, sent troops to intercept them. At a small town called Budaors, a brief, pathetic battle erupted where Hungarians were forced to fire on Hungarians. It was a disaster for the poorly equipped royalists. Utterly unwilling to be the cause of a major civil war, a horrified Karl ordered his men to surrender. He and Zita were taken prisoner. This time, the great powers of Europe had had enough. Convinced that Karl was a permanent source of instability, they decided to remove him from the continent for good. Their chosen place of exile was the remote, windswept Portuguese island of Madeira, a beautiful but isolated rock in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The family's exile in Madeira was the final tragic chapter of the last emperor's life. They were sent there with almost no money and housed in a damp, cold villa on a mountainside, a house often shrouded in a chilling fog that seeped into the very bones. Karl, the former ruler of 50 million people, was reduced to spending his days trying to find affordable food for his growing family and teaching his children their lessons, his only remaining kingly duty. Empress Zita, a princess who had been raised in unimaginable luxury, now had to mend the family's worn-out clothes and learn to cook on a small stove. For Maximilian, now living with his own small family in Bavaria, the news that trickled in from Madeira was a source of constant, helpless pain. He could offer little more than moral support through letters as he watched his brother's health and vibrant spirit slowly decline in his island prison. In March 1922, less than 5 months after arriving in Madeira, Karl, his immune system irrevocably weakened by years of wartime stress and the poor living conditions of exile, caught a severe cold that quickly developed into pneumonia. Without access to proper medical care, his condition deteriorated with terrifying speed. He died on April 1st, 1922, at the age of just 34. His final days were a testament to his deep Catholic faith and his profound love for his family. He held a crucifix to his lips, whispering, "Thy holy will be done." And his last words to a weeping Zita were, "I love you so much." The news of his brother's lonely, impoverished death, likely arriving via a cold, impersonal telegram, was the single most devastating moment of Maximilian's life. It was more than the loss of a beloved sibling. It was the final, irrevocable death of the world they had been born into. The cause was lost. The dream of restoration was now buried with Karl in that distant island churchyard. His brother's tragic fate became the defining, life-altering lesson for Maximilian. He had seen with his own eyes where grand political ambition and a noble refusal to accept reality had led. He had watched it destroy his brother's health, impoverish his family, and lead him to an early, lonely grave. He vowed in his quiet grief that he would not follow the same path. With Karl gone, the titular head of the House of Habsburg was now his 10-year-old nephew, Otto. But the practical burden of survival fell to the remaining adults, while the formidable Empress Zita dedicated her long, stoic widowhood to raising her son as the pretender to the throne, relentlessly pursuing the family's political claims. Maximilian made a quiet, deliberate, and profound choice to step away from the struggle. He sought not a lost crown, but a peaceful life. He, Franziska, and their young son, Ferdinand, a second son, Heinrich, would be born in 1925, settled permanently in Bavaria, near the shores of Lake Starnberg. It was a region filled with monarchist sympathizers, a place where a throneless archduke could live with a measure of respect and, most importantly, privacy. Here, He devoted himself entirely to his new role, that of a husband and father. His ambition was no longer to be the emperor's brother, but to be a good provider for his own family. He managed their very limited finances with meticulous care, oversaw his son's education, and created a home that was an island of stability and love in a vast sea of loss. He lived a life of quiet dignity, finding solace in his faith, his family, and the predictable, gentle rhythms of a private life. He had lost an empire, but he was determined not to lose himself. He had seen the terrible price of loyalty to a lost cause, and he would spend the rest of his life paying a different, more sustainable price, the price of peace, by accepting that his world was gone forever. Having established a fragile peace in the quiet countryside of Bavaria, Maximilian believed he had finally escaped the turbulent currents of history. He had found a new purpose in the simple, profound duties of a husband and father. But the 1930s brought with them a new and even more monstrous ideology that was spreading across Germany. The rise of Nazism, with its inherent hatred for the old aristocratic and Catholic order the Habsburgs represented, would prove that no refuge was truly safe, forcing the throneless Archduke into a second, more terrifying exile, and testing his quiet resilience once more against the full force of a world descending into madness. The death of his brother Emperor Karl on the desolate, windswept island of Madeira in 1922 was more than a personal tragedy. It was a historical full stop. It was the moment the grand gilded book on the Austro Hungarian Empire was slammed shut, its final sorrowful chapter written in poverty and pneumonia. For the survivors adrift in its wake, particularly for Archduke Maximilian Eugen, the task was no longer to reclaim the past, but to somehow endure the future. The decade that followed his brother's death was a quiet, deliberate, and deeply profound exercise in building a new life from the rubble of a shattered world. He and his wife, Princess Franziska zu Hohenlohe-Waldenburg Schillingsfürst, found a modest sanctuary in a villa on the shores of Lake Starnberg in Bavaria. The placid, deep blue waters of the lake and the gentle surrounding hills offered a stark, soothing contrast to the rigid imperial grandeur of Vienna and the turbulent politics that had defined their youth. Here, Maximilian consciously and successfully retreated from the turbulent, often bitter world of émigré politics. He watched from a distance as his formidable sister-in-law, the Dowager Empress Zita, relentlessly pursued the family's dynastic claims, raising his young nephew Otto to be a king in waiting. Maximilian, however, chose a different path. His world was no longer one of gilded carriages, formal court functions, and crisp military parades. It was a world circumscribed by the gentle rhythms of domesticity and the profound responsibilities of fatherhood. He discovered a quiet, grounding purpose in the mundane challenges of managing the family's precarious finances, a task for which his imperial upbringing had left him utterly unprepared, but which he tackled with a meticulous, almost scholarly care. He devoted himself to the education of his two sons, Ferdinand and Heinrich, facing the unique paradox of raising boys who carried the weight of one of Europe's most significant names, yet who would have to make their own way in a world that saw that name as a historical relic. Above all, he dedicated himself to creating for Franziska, his steadfast partner through years of trauma, a sanctuary of stability and love. Their home became an island of peace in a sea of loss. It was here that he fully embraced a new identity. He shed the title that was both a phantom limb and a political liability, asking the locals to refer to him simply as Dr. Habsburg, a quiet, dignified gentleman living a private life. The title, likely a nod to a doctorate in law he had once pursued, was more than a name. It was a declaration. It signified the final painful acceptance that the world of archdukes was gone. For a precious time it seemed he had succeeded in outrunning history. His past, with all its splendor and sorrow, was becoming a grand but distant memory, a story he might one day tell his grandchildren. But the shadows of history are long, relentless, and inescapable. The peace he had so carefully constructed was built on the fragile ground of a Europe descending into a new, far more terrifying kind of madness. Germany, a nation humiliated by defeat, crippled by the Treaty of Versailles, and ravaged by economic depression, became the fertile soil for the hateful and venomous ideology of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. From its very inception, the House of Habsburg was the natural and avowed enemy of National Socialism. Hitler's hatred was not merely political, it was a deeply personal and obsessive vendetta. A failed artist from the multi-ethnic Austrian Empire, he both loathed and envied. Hitler despised everything the Habsburg dynasty represented. He saw them as cosmopolitan, internationalist, devoutly Catholic protectors of their Jewish subjects, and proponents of a supranational order, the very antithesis of his fanatical vision for a racially pure, brutally nationalistic Greater Germany. He viewed them not just as political rivals to be overcome, but as a living symbol of a world order that had to be utterly and violently obliterated. Maximilian's nephew, Otto von Habsburg, the young, charismatic, and intellectually brilliant head of the house, fully understood this threat and met it head-on. He was a fierce, courageous, and articulate opponent of Nazism. From his exile in Belgium, he lobbied tirelessly across Europe and America, meeting with presidents like Franklin D. Roosevelt and prime ministers like Winston Churchill, warning with prophetic accuracy of the existential danger Hitler posed to civilization. He promoted the idea of an independent Danubian federation, a modern reimagining of the old empire as a constitutional monarchy that could serve as a bulwark against German expansionism. This noble political activism, however, made him a primary target of the Reich and placed the entire family in mortal danger. Though Maximilian himself remained steadfastly apolitical, his name and his bloodline were enough to make him an enemy of the state. He was a Habsburg, and in the twisted, paranoid logic of the Nazis that made him guilty by birth. The fragile illusion of safety shattered completely and irrevocably in the cold days of March 1938. In an act of brazen aggression that stunned a passive and appeasing Europe, German troops marched into Austria, annexing Maximilian's homeland in the so-called Anschluss. The swastika, the crooked cross of a hateful ideology, was raised over the Hofburg Palace in Vienna, the home of his ancestors for over 600 years. For the Habsburgs, this was a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. Any faint, lingering, romantic hope of a restoration was extinguished forever, crushed under the treads of German tanks. More immediately, it put those members of the family still living within the new German borders in mortal peril. The Gestapo moved with brutal efficiency, arresting dozens of monarchist leaders and Habsburg relatives. Two of Maximilian's cousins, Max and Ernst von Hohenberg, the sons of the assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, were arrested and sent to the Dachau concentration camp. There, they would endure years of torture and humiliation, a clear and terrifying message sent to the rest of the family. No one was safe. For Maximilian and his family in their lakeside villa in Bavaria, that message was received with chilling clarity. They were now living deep inside the belly of the beast. Their home was no longer a refuge, but a trap. There could be no question of staying. For the second time in his life, he was a fugitive. He was forced to pack what few belongings he could carry, to abandon the home where he had painstakingly built a decade of peace, and to flee for his life. He was once again a refugee, dispossessed not by the Republicans of his homeland, but by a totalitarian regime that sought to erase his very name from history. He, Franziska, and their sons made their way to France, seeking safety in a country that was itself living on borrowed time, blissfully unaware of the storm about to break over its own head. Their life in France during the war years was one of constant gnawing uncertainty and palpable anxiety. They were stateless, possessing papers that offered little real protection, living as quietly and invisibly as possible to avoid attracting the attention of the authorities. After France itself fell to the Germans in 1940, their situation became even more precarious. The man who was born a prince of one of Europe's greatest empires, who had commanded armies and lived in palaces, was now reduced to the precarious status of a stateless person, his survival dependent on the kindness of strangers and the ability to remain unnoticed by a hostile occupying force. The ultimate irony, and perhaps the ultimate vindication of their family's journey, was embodied in the fate of his two sons. Ferdinand and Heinrich, the great-nephews of Emperor Franz Joseph, eventually managed to secure passage to the United States. When America entered the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor, they both enlisted in the U.S. Army. In a stunning historical twist, the two young Habsburg princes, bearers of 1,000 years of European royalty, fought in American uniforms against the Nazi regime that had driven their family from their home. Their honorable service was a definitive symbol of the family's complete and final break with the old world and their integration into the new. They were fighting not for a lost crown or a vanished empire, but for the ideals of the democratic republic that had given them refuge. When the Second World War finally ended in 1945, leaving a continent in ruins and ashes, the map of Europe had been redrawn once more. Germany was defeated and divided. Austria was restored as a small, independent republic, but it would remain occupied by the Allied powers for a decade. And in a cruel twist of fate, much of the old Austro Hungarian Empire, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, had disappeared behind a new Iron Curtain, subjected to another form of soul-crushing totalitarianism under the Soviet Union. The world that Maximilian had been born into was not just gone, it was now utterly, fantastically unimaginable. Maximilian spent his final years in France, eventually settling in the southern city of Nice, whose gentle Mediterranean climate was kinder to his failing health. The long cumulative years of stress, displacement, and financial insecurity had taken a heavy toll. The vibrant young Archduke who had gallantly charged into battle in 1914 was now a weary, prematurely aged man, his face a map of the sorrows he had endured. He lived long enough to see his sons build new, successful lives for themselves in America and to welcome the birth of his first grandchildren, the quiet, unassuming continuation of a family line that had survived against all odds. He died peacefully on the 19th of January, 1952, at the age of 56. His passing went largely unnoticed by the world. There were no grand state funerals, no obituaries in international newspapers lamenting the loss of a great historical figure. He was buried not in the imperial crypt in Vienna alongside his imperial ancestors, but in a simple grave in Salzburg, a quiet final resting place in the homeland he had been forbidden to live in for most of his adult life. In the grand, sweeping, and often impersonal narrative of history, Archduke Maximilian Eugen of Austria is a minor character, a footnote in the story of his more famous brother, and the cataclysmic fall of their empire. Yet his life is a moving and deeply human testament to the staggering personal cost of those great events. He was born into the golden twilight of an ancient world, a world of absolute certainty, privilege, and duty, only to be forced to spend his entire adult life navigating the chaotic, violent darkness that followed. He was not a kingmaker, a politician, or a revolutionary. He was a witness. He witnessed the mechanized horrors of industrial warfare, the collapse of a civilization, the profound agony of exile, and the rise of a monstrous tyranny that sought to devour the world. His life provides the most poignant answer to the question posed at the very beginning. What becomes of a prince when there is no longer a kingdom? Some fight and die for their lost cause, like his brother Karl. Some dedicate their lives to political struggle, like his nephew Otto. And some, like Maximilian, make a different, quieter choice. He chose to retreat, not out of cowardice, but out of a profound and hard-won understanding of what truly mattered. Having lost everything the world considers valuable, his country, his status, his fortune, he dedicated himself to preserving the one thing he had left, his family. His legacy is not a crown, a policy, or a battle won. It is the quiet, unwavering dignity with which he endured the unimaginable. He was the last prince of a ghost empire, a man who lived a long epilogue to a story that ended too soon, and who, in the profound silence of his forgotten life, found a quiet, noble, and deeply human kind of peace.